Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, so for this morning, we will have enzyme kinetics. Morning. Feedback. Morning, we will have enzyme kinetics. Feedback. We will have enzyme kinetics. Okay, so we'll start off with the definition of enzymes. So basic um, principle would be enzymes are protein. So that is important when we would be talking about rates of reaction. And it increases rate of reactions without being changed in the overall process. Okay, so think of it. I'm very much into development work. Think of it as a community organizer. You go to the community, you facilitate development or facilitate changes there. But a sustainable community organizer would have to lead the community so that you would look for another community to catalyze transformation. So you make the reaction faster, but you are not part of the equation. So enzyme kinetics, by definition, then would be a field of biochemistry which is concerned with the quantitative measurement of the rates of enzyme catalyzed reactions and the systematic study of the factors that affect these rates. So, like it or not, we will be dealing with numbers, with some computations or some derivations of equations. Okay. Objectives for this lecture. So discuss the catalysis of enzymes in terms of energy change in a reaction. Define free energy of activation. To discuss catalysis of enzymes in terms of chemically facilitated active sites. To identify the factors influencing velocity of enzyme catalyzed reactions. Discuss the derivation of the Michaelis-Menten equation. Correlate Lineweaver-Burke plot with the rate of enzyme reaction and inhibition. So differentiate the various types of enzyme inhibition. Discuss regulation of enzyme activity and the importance of enzymes in clinical diagnosis and treatment of diseases. Okay. So first we would have your terms. So remember that there's a unit of activity. So this is the amount of enzyme that could catalyze a reaction, 1 nanomole of substrate per minute. Okay, enzymes have specific activity. So it's the number of enzyme units per ml divided by the concentration of protein in milligrams per milliliter. So they are quoted as units per milligrams. We have your turnover number, which is your KCAT. So the number of molecules of substrate converted to product per enzyme molecule per second. Okay. Wait lang. Ikay. May lecture. Tatayan mo. Okay. So catalysis of enzymes. So we will have free energy of activation. So what does this mean? So there's an energy difference between that of the reactant and transition state And this is a high energy intermediate that occurs during the formation of the product. So there would be no difference for the energy in the overall reaction, either uncatalyzed or catalyzed. When you have your enzymes, the energy of activation gets lowered, thereby making the process easier for A to proceed into B, which is the final state or your product. Okay. So the rate of reaction of this process will be determined by the number of energized molecules, and they must contain sufficient energy to overcome the energy barrier of the transition state. So you have to overcome this barrier, either you lower or you try to increase your effort to go into the transition state. Okay. So this would be our diagram. So your initial state would be your A. Transition state, if it's uncatalyzed, it would follow the blue curve. If it has enzymes, it will follow the red curve. Thereby, you have a lower energy of activation and thereby proceeding with your final state of products. That difference would be your delta G, or the energy produced. So there are different factors that would affect reaction velocity. It would be listed in this slide. So, of course, the substrate would be one factor, temperature, your pH, enzyme, time, and products of the reaction. Okay, let's go through it one by one. Okay. You have to know the concept of your substrate velocity curve. So what does this mean? So you have your substrate and your reaction velocity. Okay? So for the rate or velocity of a reaction would depend on the number of substrate molecules converted to the product per unit of time. Naturally, you will say the more substrate, the faster the reaction would occur. Okay. But it has a limit. So this is your Vmax. Why is there a limit? Would anyone know? Why is there a Vmax, or there's a limit with the increase in velocity compared to the amount of substrate? If you remember your basic chemistry in your undergrad, what concept would explain that? Anyone?
Hello,
Anyone?
Doctor.
Yes.
Because of saturation po.
Okay. So because of saturation or supersaturation, meaning, of course, remember we have receptors. So if all the receptors are already filled up, then no increase, no matter how much more you increase the substrate, there would not be any increase anymore. So it is just like your how fast a supermarket would facilitate people. So it would depend on the number of cash registers. So if it's already filled up, even if there are more people, there's a limit to the number of customers that you would be able to serve, because that would be your equivalent to your rate limiting step. Okay. Your enzyme should follow your Michaelis-Menten kinetics, which shows a hyperbolic curve, meaning steep increase as your substrate increases, but as it nears your saturation mark, it would be asymptotic to your Vmax line. Okay. Your allosteric enzymes, on the other hand, would follow a sigmoid curve. Okay, we will see that later. Okay. Another factor would be your temperature. Okay. Of course, we know that as temperature increases, velocity of your substrates would be in a very excitatory state. So the increase of velocity increases your activity. Okay. However, there's a narrow window as it reaches your higher temperature. Okay, and why is that so? It's already in your diagram because of your denaturation of your proteins. At certain levels, usually at 40 degrees, it gets denatured such that it won't work anymore, thereby the steep decline in velocity with higher temperatures. Okay. So as you can see, it's an asymmetric curve. And as I have mentioned, enzyme becomes unstable and loses its activity as a result of protein denaturation. So we've had substrate, we have your temperature. And then we would have your pH. Your pH would affect your ionization of your active site. Your pH also may denature your protein enzymes, and they work at different pH levels. Of course, your stomach enzymes, like for example, pepsin, would want your acidic environment. Alkaline phosphatase would want your basic environment, and your trypsin would be around the middle. Okay. Why is it bell curved? Why is it not just at 7, it's at a peak, and then less than that, it will not work. So you have it follows a bell curve. Every enzyme would behave this way, such that, so a basic group, for example, your pKa would be 8. It has to be protonated in order to become active. Another would have pKa 6, which is only active in a dissociated state. Optimally at 7, so around 90% of both groups are present in the active form. Thereby, it's at its peak. A little above or a little lower values, one or the other of the groups, of course, your enzymes would have both groups, increasingly passes into the inactive state. Okay, so because our enzymes would not be in pure form, you have your amino acids which behave differently. So there would be a bell curve effect. So that is pH. So you have your substrate, you have your temperature, and you have your pH. Okay. So we would try to make this simple. So this is the derivation of your Michaelis-Menten equation. Okay. So your E would be your enzyme. S would be your substrate, and you join them together so that there would be an enzyme substrate complex. Then it would be converted into the product, and as I have mentioned, your enzyme does not get consumed. So you have your enzyme. Your K1, K to the negative 1, and K2 would be your constants. Okay. Another way to express it would be through initial reaction velocity, which is your V0, which would be equal to your Vmax times your substrate over your Michaelis constant, which is your Km, plus substrate. If you remember constants, K negative 1 plus K2 over K1 is also equal to your Km. Okay, so what will we do with this equation? First, we would need to have assumptions. So Michaelis-Menten equation assumes that there's only one substrate before we go into your bisubstrate kinetics. Okay, so there are three assumptions which we will try to make simple by using these diagrams. So looking at this diagram wherein S would be your substrate and E would be your enzyme, how would you interpret this diagram? And this is equivalent to your first assumption for Michaelis-Menten equation. Anyone who wants to try? There's no right or wrong answer. What's your interpretation?
Doc, try ko po.
Yes. Sige, go ahead.
Yung substrate po, yung substrate concentration is mas malaki compared dun sa
Okay.
enzyme.
So
Yun po.
your substrate is so much greater than your enzyme, as depicted by the S and the E that's almost not seen. And you know that if you use those in equations, what will happen? It's your substrate concentration is so much greater than your enzyme that in the equation, your enzyme would be insignificant in your computation. So that is the first assumption. Okay. So that is almost equal to 0 or very negligible, your enzyme. So that makes the equation easier. Okay, next. So your ES does not change with time. Although we know that in any reaction, there is wastage. For example, you are to funnel 1 liter of water into another container. Okay? There would be a drop of water that could escape, or 2 or 3, maybe even more. But we will not factor that into the equation because we will assume that the rate of synthesis would be equal to the rate of degradation. So your equation does not allow any wastage. Okay? It does not change with time or does not regress. Okay, that's the second assumption. Of course, you will read in your biochemistry books a longer definition or longer statement of these assumptions. Okay, but I'm just presenting you the concept so that we could understand easier. And the third, so initial reaction velocities are used. Okay, so if we use your initial reaction velocities, what would that mean? So how will velocity start? It would always start somewhere, and it will start at zero, such that it would be very much decreased so that you could disregard the first side of the equation because initial reaction velocities would be very much decreased. Okay. Thereby using the formula, your constant, your enzyme, substrate, complex, you would end up with your enzyme plus substrate, ends up with your enzyme substrate complex, and produce an enzyme plus product. Okay, that is how it is derived. Okay, so what are the conclusions of this equation? So your Michaelis constant would be characteristic of an enzyme. So it would be specific. It would be also particular for a substrate. And it would reflect the affinity of the enzyme for that substrate. And each enzyme would have different affinities for a certain substrate, etc., etc. Okay. So next concepts that we would want to familiarize ourselves with would be the relationship of your Km to your affinity of the enzyme for the substrate. So if you have a large Km of the enzyme as depicted by, as depicted by the red line, if your Km is large, it would have a low affinity for the substrate. Okay? As is shown by the flattened red curve. If you have a small Km for the enzyme, so it would be a higher affinity of enzyme for the substrate. Thereby, it would have a more peak curve for small Km and large Km. So large Km, low affinity. Small Km would be a high affinity for the substrate. Okay. To conclude, okay, so your rate of reaction, how fast your reaction proceeds, would be directly proportional to your initial velocity and Vmax, okay, which we will see later in competitive and non-competitive inhibition. Its further relation with each other. Okay. So you have your, again, you have your reaction velocity and your substrate. Okay. If your substrate concentration is low or so much less than your Km, so the velocity of the reaction is first order. And what does this mean? It is proportional to substrate concentration. Okay. At the higher concentrations where substrate is very much greater than your Km, as mentioned, we have the concept of saturation. Okay, so the velocity of the reaction is zero order, meaning it is nearing a constant and independent of substrate concentration because it is nearing its maximal velocity. So this would be your enzymatic plots. So your Lineweaver-Burke. So look at it as a reciprocal of your Michaelis-Menten equation. You look at initial velocity, your Km over Vmax times substrate plus 1 over Vmax. And you could plot it in a line. Okay. So you start with the equation. Remember your initial velocity, Vmax times substrate over Km plus substrate. You get the reciprocal of the equation, and that is your 1 over initial velocity, Km Vmax substrate plus 1 over Vmax. So your Lineweaver-Burke equation would be equal to your slope and would be like the equation for a straight line, wherein if you remember, y is equal to ax plus b, where what your y is your 1 over v and your x is your 1 net substrate. Okay, so if you have your values, then you could plot for your slope, your Vm over Km, negative over Km, and so on and so forth. Okay, don't worry. I will not ask you to plot in the exam because this takes time and we have limited time during exams. Okay? So, what I want you to know though would be its advantages. So, it allows a more accurate determination of your Vmax, which can only be approximated from a simple plot of V1 compared to S, compared to your substrate. And this double reciprocal plot of your enzyme reaction rates would be very useful in distinguishing certain types of enzymatic reaction mechanisms. Okay. So therefore, a plot of 1 over V as Y as a function of your 1 times substrate as your X would give a straight line whose intercept would be 1 over Vmax and whose slope is K over Vmax. So this is what we're saying as your double reciprocal or Lineweaver-Burke plot. And if you set the term equation equal to 0 and you solve for X, it will reveal that the X-intercept, it would be 1 over Km. Okay. So we have your isosteric and your allosteric enzymes. So the efficiency of substrate binding declines constantly with your increasing A because the number of free binding sites is constantly decreasing. So the binding sites would be decreasing as it becomes occupied. So this is what we were talking about earlier. So it would decline because of saturation. If it's allosteric, your sigmoid curve, so binding efficiency initially rises with A because the free enzyme is present in a low affinity conformation. So this is gradually converted to a higher affinity form as a result with the binding of A. Okay. That is why your isosteric would follow your hyperbolic curve. This one would follow your sigmoid. Okay. So this would explain your bisubstrate kinetics. Okay. In an ideal world, your Michaelis-Menten would be ideal. One substrate. But of course, I'm sure even as early as now, you will see in biochemistry that there's no such thing or almost no such thing. And your enzyme reactions, your biochemical reactions would occur simultaneously, one after the other, etc., etc. Thereby, most reactions in our biochemical systems would include two substrates and two products, as shown in A plus B would produce B plus Q. And in these reactions, the transfer of your functional group, your ammonium group, your phospho group, from one substrate to the other would occur. For example, in oxidation reduction reactions, electrons would be the one transferred between substrates. And there are multiple substrate reactions, and they are divided into two classes. Okay. First one is sequential. Second is double displacement. Okay. Sorry, nagkabaliktad. So high values that lack of free binding sites becomes noticeable and the binding strength decreases again. Kaya pala kulang kanina. So eventually, at higher values, again, it will also reach saturation, and again, the binding strength would decrease. Okay. So first, we would go to your sequential. So your all substrate must bind to the enzyme before any product would be released. So in both instances, both substrates must combine with the enzyme to form a complex before catalysis can proceed and would produce a product. It could either be random, substrate A or B combines to form an enzyme substrate complex, or it could be ordered or compulsory, wherein substrate A must form your enzyme substrate complex first before it binds with B. Okay? And many enzymes that have NAD plus or NADH would be an example of a sequential ordered mechanism, such that your lactate dehydrogenase reduces your pyruvate to lactate while oxidizing NADH plus NAD plus. Yun pala. Okay, so this would be your pyruvate catalyzed by your lactate dehydrogenase and oxidizes your NADH and produces your lactate and your NAD plus. Okay. So any NAD plus or NADH, think sequential ordered mechanism. Okay. So in the ordered sequential mechanism, coenzyme always binds first and the lactate is always released first. So your enzyme, your NADH, pyruvate. Your lactate is released as your coenzyme binds, and then NAD plus, and then your enzyme goes away to look for another substrate to catalyze. Okay. Random sequential mechanism. So the order of substrates and release of products, okay, of course, would be random, such as in the formation of phosphocreatine and ADP from ATP and creatine, So this would be catalyzed by your creatine kinase. So your creatine would be added to your ATP. So that's your enzyme substrate, plus your enzyme would be your creatine kinase. Then your enzyme product would be your phosphocreatine and your ADP. Or can also be denoted in this kind of notation. So same way, this is creatine plus ATP. You add creatine kinase and you would have your phosphocreatine plus your ADP and then your enzyme. Okay, so there are two ways to express or draw your chemical reactions. Okay. Your next would be your ping pong. Okay. So what's the difference? So one or more products are released from the enzyme before all the substrates have been added. Okay. Mechanisms in which the first substrate A is bound and immediately cleave. So you start at your free enzyme, then you would first form your enzyme plus substrate A complex. Then it would have a product. Then you have your intermediate product E, which would then form another complex with another substrate. Then it would form another P2 and then goes the cycle. Okay. A part of the substrate remains bound to the enzyme and is then transferred to the second substrate after the first product has been released. So it is like a cycle. Okay, most reactions would be like that. It would start a chain reaction and then eventually go back. So your cycles are like this. Okay? Multi-substrate reactions before the enzyme goes back to your free enzyme state. Okay. What are the examples? The enzyme aspartate aminotransferase catalyzes the transfer of an amino group from aspartate to alpha ketoglutarate. So you start with your aspartate, okay? And then it is catalyzed by your aspartate aminotransferase, okay? And your amino group would be released and you would produce your alpha ketoglutarate. Okay, so what is released would be your oxaloacetate. Product would be your alpha ketoglutarate and glutamate. Okay, if you would use your notation, it would look like this, the ping pong. Okay. Next concept would be the presence of inhibitors in a reaction. Here you have your Vmax and your Km and its relation. Okay, so with competitive inhibition, Km is increased if there is a presence of a competitive inhibitor. So what would it mean if your Km is increased? It would flatten the curve. So meaning you have to have more substrate for the reaction to occur. Your Vmax is the same in the presence of competitive inhibitor. So even if you have the same substrate, or the same substrate concentration, your Vmax would be the same in competitive inhibition. What changes? Your Km, and it would need more substrate because they share, remember, your competitive inhibitor share the same binding site. Okay? Do I have another slide for that? None. Okay. So they share the same binding site. Think of it as you competing for example, you courting a girl, two boys. Okay. You're competing for the same seat. What do? So you increase your efforts. So as you increase your efforts, then you will be the one that would be noticed by the girl. So that's competitive inhibition. Okay, next. For non-competitive, what is affected would be your Vmax, which is decreased in the presence of a non-competitive inhibitor. Your Michaelis constant is unchanged in the presence of your non-competitive inhibitor. So, using the analogy of the binding sites, since you change the configuration of the binding site into something else, then even any amount of substrate would not matter even if you increase substrate concentration. You're non-competitive, in non-competitive inhibition, that would not matter. So for example, same example, you are two boys competing for a binding site. But in non-competitive, does not change configuration such that cannot accept you, meaning not interested in boys or wants to be a nun, etc. So not any increase of effort would not have any effect. So that is non-competitive inhibition. So Vmax is decreased, Km is unchanged. In competitive, Km is increased, Vmax is unchanged. Okay. In the exam, kahit anong pabali-baliktad niyan, you have to know the relationship of the four and the relationship and its relation to competitive and non-competitive inhibitions. Okay. So this would be your feedback mechanism for your substrate. Okay. So if you have your hyperbolic and your sigmoid, so your Km would either be increased or decreased, and your affinity will be affected, and it would depend on how it will approach your Vmax. Okay. This is also feedback mechanism, which is also common in a lot of biochemical reactions. For example, production of insulin. If there's so much insulin, your feedback mechanism will tell you, oh, there's so much insulin, stop producing. Or there's no insulin, start producing. Okay? And we will learn of that when we look at gene regulation eventually in our latter lectures. Okay. So this is also an example of your enzymes. Now, why do we have to study enzymes in the first place? And what is the relation of studying, this is my last slide, of studying enzymes in clinical practice? Why is it important for me to understand? How can you see it being relevant in your practice being a doctor? Or how would these concepts help you in becoming a better doctor? What would its role be in clinical practice? As far as you know. Where is
Hello
it
po.
used?
Teacher,
Yes. Yeah.
having too much or too little of a certain enzyme can lead to certain reactions po. So dapat po we should know the rate at which they are made in order to notice when to start or intervene po.
How does that translate to clinical practice? Knowing that there should not be an excess or no deficit of these enzymes. So we have to achieve homeostasis. So where do you see enzymes playing a role? So it's true. You will see that a lot of diseases would have deficiency in enzymes and thereby produce disease, or absence of enzymes or excess of it would produce certain kinds of diseases. Sorry, I interrupted you. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, Doktor. Ayun din po naman sasabihin.
Okay. So your diseases, for example, G6PD, you have deficit of your G6PD enzyme. And where else? So disease itself, deficit. So how will you correct these deficits? Or first, how would you diagnose these deficits? Enzymes would also be at the forefront of this. You measure the enzyme that is present in the body. Thereby, you know if there's an increase or there's a deficit. Now that you know that there's increase or decrease, what's the next step? It also has a role in therapeutics. So you know that there's a decrease in this enzyme. What will therapeutics do? You give the enzyme either as a tablet, and you will see a lot of medicines that would be enzyme-based or cofactor-based. Or affect the synthesis of certain enzymes. And that is how the importance of enzymes and how these reactions would work. Albeit clinically, you don't look at it at a molecular level much. Okay? But it is very, very useful in clinical practice. At least the concepts that we have discussed for this afternoon. All right? Any questions? Quiz tayo, quiz. Walang gustong sumagot to. Any questions before I ask questions? Sorry. Sorry. Any questions?
No more questions, Doktora.
Ako na magtatanong. Sige na nga, wag na lang. I would just give so that you would have an idea on how to answer questions on this topic. I will just send a post lecture quiz that you could answer within the day at your own time. Okay? Is that okay? Wala naman kayong choice, no, diba? Sige. So I will just send it's just a 5 or 10 MCQ. All right? So if there are no excuse me, if there are no more questions, we may leave this sorry, I have to open your cameras. We have to document because we did not go face to face.